Hi everyone, welcome to the New England Energy Management Best Practice Network's webinar on building performance standards and ways to meet them. For those of you who are not familiar with the network, this is a New England-based regional network of industrial end users, utilities, and strategic energy managers brought together with a common goal of saving energy. The network hosts virtual meetings and webinars that focus on informing members on the latest energy management practices. Today we have a great round of speakers. If you could all put your, sorry, I was going to say turn your cameras on, but just so you're all aware, we are actually not able to turn our cameras on during this WebEx event, so that's why we don't have our cameras on at this time, just so you are all aware. But this webinar is going to start with Brendan Hall from EPA's Energy Star HQ, who will be providing an overview of building performance standards, or BPS, requirements in the U.S. Brendan supports state and local governments across the U.S. that are designing and implementing initiatives focusing on improving energy and greenhouse gas performance in commercial and multifamily buildings in their jurisdictions. Next, we'll have Hannah Payne from the City of Boston, who will be presenting on Boston's Building Energy Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, or BERDO 2.0. Hannah is the Carbon Neutrality Program Manager for the City of Boston and manages the City of Boston's building decarbonization programs, including BERDO. And lastly, we'll have Dennis Villanueva from the Mass General Brigham, who will be presenting on Mass General Brigham Energy Consumption and Emissions Reduction Pathway. Dennis is the Energy and Sustainability, Real Estate and Facilities Senior Manager at Mass General Brigham and is involved in all aspects related to energy for Mass General Brigham's facilities operations, ranging from energy procurement, on-site and off-site generation, long-term renewable power procurement agreements, and energy conservation and emission reductions program. So before we kick off with our first speaker, I'm going to pull a survey question. So we're going to put that up here. It might take a minute for it to pop up on your screen, but it should be off to your right near the chat. So this first question is, are you familiar with building performance standards, or BPS? So these answers are A, no, this is my first time hearing about BPS. B, I have heard of BPS, but I am not very familiar. C, yes, I am familiar with BPS, but do not fall under an ordinance. Or D, yes, I fall under a BPS ordinance. So I'll give you a few seconds to all answer that question, and then we can take a look at what the consensus is here for this question. All right, and we are going to close out the question now. Thank you all for answering. All right, we should get a summary coming up here. Sorry, there's a slight delay in that. But you can see here that it looks like the majority have answered B in this instance. So they have heard of BPS, but they're not very familiar. So that's great that you joined this webinar so you can learn a little bit about that. And the others are pretty even spread on this is their first time hearing it, or yes, they're familiar and they don't fall under an ordinance, or they do fall under an ordinance. So no matter what category, we're going to kick it off here with Brendan Hall, who's going to give us a little bit of an introduction on this. So Brendan, take it away.
Thanks, Madeline, and happy to be with everybody. As Madeline mentioned, my name is Brendan Hall, and I am one of two staff from the EPA Energy Star headquarters that supports state and local governments across the country, including those that are implementing building performance standards. Go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to start really quick by reviewing Energy Star. I'm pretty confident many of you are aware of our program, but just to show the connection to this topic. So next slide real quick. So why focus on buildings and plants? Our program at Energy Star is focused on commercial buildings and industrial plants because they represent about 45% of the U.S.'s carbon dioxide emissions. So that's really the thrust of our program, is to try and reduce those emissions. And then if you go to the next slide, we also do this work because there is a lot of energy waste in buildings. So that suggests that there's room for improvement. And go to the next slide. And how do we support improvement? So there are 3 main ways as a voluntary program that we try to do that. Those include leadership commitment, so sort of agreeing and engaging with our program, tools and resources to understand and act on energy use, and then recognition for top performance. So those are the 3 sort of prongs that we work through to try and improve performance. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was it on the sort of Energy Star background. And now we're going to shift gears into building performance standards. The results of the poll are good to know, just so I can try and frame things up for those of you that are less familiar with these policies or sort of newer to them. So I'll be careful to really define things as well as I can. Next slide, please. So to that point, what is a building performance standard? And with this slide, I'm going to sort of compare BPS, which is the shorthand for Building Performance Standard, against benchmarking requirements, which are sort of the predecessor policy to BPS. And those requirements applied to buildings, and they had to report energy use and water use to a state or local government, and then have that information disclosed publicly by the state or local government. So compared to benchmarking requirements, we'll sort of go one by one here. So similar to those requirements, these BPS laws also apply to the same types of buildings, commercial buildings and multifamily residential buildings. They also do target the same thing of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. On this next bullet, so BPS is really looked to sort of as the next evolution of policy that is aiming to drive deeper reductions from building energy use and thereby GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So there have been a couple of different sort of implementations by state and local governments looking to achieve deeper reductions than we were seeing in benchmarking and disclosure requirements. So some of those were mandatory audits, sometimes hinging on level performance, mandatory retrocommissioning or retuning of building systems, again, sometimes hinging on building performance. New efforts to try and disclose performance to the market in more powerful ways. But really, so these BPS laws are viewed as sort of a way to achieve deeper reductions, and there's some sort of alignment of different governments across the country around this policy approach. A building performance standard is also a long-term policy that's sort of targeting certain levels of performance or standards over time. So there's sort of a long-term level of performance that a building needs to hit, and then in the interim, usually at like every 4 or 5 years, there's an interim target of performance, and the level of performance is ratcheting up over time. So it gets, you know, the level that you have to reach as a building owner is going up and up over time. So those things compare with benchmarking requirements, whereas there's not really any requirement to hit a certain level of performance, and there's not really any deadline beyond the annual requirement to report. So these are really specifying what level of performance a building needs to hit and when, and they're over a longer time horizon. And the last thing here, often these standards align with state or local greenhouse gas reduction goals. So that's often sort of the driver behind these policies, and then the proportion attributable to buildings is sort of in their emissions inventories. The BPS is one part of how they're going to get to that goal. So that's also a difference with benchmarking requirements that maybe aren't as clearly tied to a reduction or deeper reduction. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and this is a map of the building performance standard requirements that have passed to date. I'll note that there's some gray area on what actually counts as a building performance standard. So there are a few jurisdictions that some might consider to be BPS that aren't here, but we're sort of using the map here from the Institute for Market Transformation rather than creating one of our own. But anyway, in Denver and Colorado, just pointing out that as the first example where there's a state requirement and a local requirement, which will create some interesting things to work through. Next slide, please. Okay, and now I want to talk a little bit about some differences among the policies that have passed to date. So among the BPS policies that I just showed, what are some key differences? The next two slides after this are sort of a long table that goes through all these things in more depth, or some of these things. But so we'll get to see the specific application, but some differences in these BPS policies. So there are different sizes and types of buildings that are covered by the policies, and how properties are defined also differs in some jurisdictions. So as I mentioned before, that there are certain standards that buildings need to hit, both in the interim and long term. Those are usually based on the property type. And so how you define what type of property a given building is matters for that point. So that's why the property type thing is mentioned there. The time frame also is a difference. So some places have a shorter time horizon, or more or less time between interim standards. Also the key metric, or metrics. We've seen some different approaches on what sort of metric you're being assessed against in your performance, be it site energy use intensity, total greenhouse gas emissions, and others. Business activity normalization, so whether and how these policies factor in business activity and sort of adjust for it in order to assess performance. That's a difference. The stringency, of course, these requirements are being passed, again, by state and local jurisdictions, often in order to achieve GHG reductions. So they're sort of looking at different levels of performance and different levels of stringency, therefore, that the buildings need to perform at. Trajectory approach, so some of these laws have a straight line or trajectory approach. That's sort of a lingo term, but the idea is that a building needs to measure its baseline and then ultimately, there's some final target that a building needs to meet, and then the interim standards are effectively linear from the baseline to the final target. So that's what the trajectory approach means, whereas some of these laws don't take that linear approach. There are also differences in the variety of pathways that building owners can take to comply, and there are differences in whether performance data needs to be verified as part of these requirements. And the last difference is sort of the level of penalties that buildings face if they fail to comply. All right, so next slide, and I'm just going to go really quickly through these. This is more of a take-home exercise or homework you can dig into on your own time. But this map is again sort of this table is sort of adapted from IMT's Building Performance Policy Center, and we have key metric, the coverage of building types, the first deadline, and sort of the basic structure of the requirements, as well as a link to the laws themselves. I'll just note one example here that's interesting is Denver. So they are the first place in the country that I know of to have electrification requirements for space and water heating at the time of replacement if it's cost effective. So one interesting sort of policy wrinkle there. Next slide, please. And then, so New York City, here I'm just going to call it a couple other interesting things. New York City's policy regulates on total greenhouse gas emissions, which is interesting. Some have thought that isn't quite fair because it factors in changes in the grid and how clean the grid is as part of, it sort of regulates buildings on that basis. So the building owner doesn't have complete control over that. Yeah, and let's see what else. I'm going to move on, I think, in the interest of time. I know I'm already running a little late. So this is available to dig into, and we can ask questions at the end if you have any specifics. So next slide, please. And next slide. And the last thing I wanted to highlight was just sort of our role in these policies and with the state and local governments passing them. So we have an advisory role on policy design. We recently put out a toolkit that talks through sort of, guidance on these requirements, benchmarking, and building performance standards. And we also put out a white paper that talks through metric selection for BPS. So both of those things are publicly available. Another important thing, I think, overall is that we bring the perspective of building owners and managers to the table, to policymakers, and vice versa. So we're sort of acting as a bridge between those two audiences. And one of the main things we are targeting there is sort of consistency in these requirements across the country, because we think it will benefit everyone and make these policies more effective in achieving reductions. We also support policymakers on implementation when they're sort of like, actually doing the work through our tool, Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That's the reporting platform for these laws. And we also have a forthcoming tool called the Building Emissions Calculator. Next slide, please. And the last thing I wanted to highlight was just the toolkit that we do have publicly available in case you wanted to learn more. It's broken into sections and again talks about benchmarking and building performance standards, and it's targeting policymakers. So with that, I'm all done, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. And for our next speaker, I'm going to hand this off to Hannah Payne. So Hannah Payne, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Payne. I am the Carbon Neutrality Program Manager with the City of Boston's Environment Department. And thanks so much to Brendan for that great introduction on BPS. So I'm going to talk about Boston's new Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, what we call BERDO 2.0. Next slide, please. Okay, looks like some of these slides might have gotten some formatting issues, so hopefully they still look okay. So I'm just going to quickly run through some climate planning context of where this policy fits within our broader climate plans in Boston. So next slide. Okay, so this is Boston's carbon footprint on the left, and you can see that large buildings account for about 50% of Boston's total emissions. So a really big portion of where our emissions reductions need to come from. Boston has a goal to have to be carbon neutral by 2050. So the graph on the right shows how we're faring in reaching that goal. The red line is where we would need to be to reach a straight line to our 2050 goal. And the blue line shows where we're at with emissions. So you can see that while we have reduced our emissions by about 1/5 since 2005, our emissions are not declining fast enough, so we need to identify additional strategies and actions to accelerate emissions reduction. So next slide. And in 2019, the City of Boston published an update to its climate action plan, which detailed how to accelerate action, climate action in the next 5 years. And one of the strategies that was identified as a high priority strategy was to develop a carbon emissions performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. So this was, putting forward that Boston needed to develop a BPS as just one of the many high priority strategies within the climate action plan. Next slide. And in Boston, this idea was building on existing policy. So in 2013, Boston created the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, so BERDO 1.0. You'll notice there's a couple words different. So instead of energy reporting, we now have emissions reduction. And this was Boston's benchmarking policy, so requiring buildings over 35,000 square feet or 35 units to report their annual energy and water usage to the city each year, and then the city would publicly disclose that information. There was also a requirement for every 5 years that buildings would need to complete an energy action or assessment. So this was already in place, and then the climate action plan was calling for an update to this to turn it into a BPS with emissions reduction targets. So next slide. And after nearly a year of effort and stakeholder engagement, lots of work that predated my time with the City of Boston, this fall, Mayor Kim Janey signed the update to BERDO, so creating the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance after unanimous approval by the City Council. So now we are working on developing the regulations for this updated ordinance, and I'm going to go through in the next few slides the details of this updated ordinance. So next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the main focus of BERDO and the update to BERDO is the creation of emission standards that begin in 2025 and decline to 0 by 2050. These emission standards are set for different building use types. So you can see in the left-hand column the different categorizations of building types, and then the emission standard for each of those building types starting in 2025 to 2029. These are based on existing data that we collected through BERDO 1.0, and then they all decline down to 0 by 2050. These emission standards were developed through a technical analysis process, and they're aligned with the citywide goals of having net zero emissions by 2050. And buildings that have multiple uses will be able to adopt a blended emission standard, so being able to account for potentially higher emissions in let's say, a restaurant or retail space versus apartments above. Next slide. So I'll just cover a few key features of the ordinance. The first, buildings will still be required to report their annual energy and water usage, as they've been required to do since 2013. The update expands the buildings that are covered by BERDO and subject to BERDO, and lowers the threshold down to 20,000 square feet for buildings with 15 or more units. Buildings will have multiple pathways to meet the emission standards. So starting in 2025, that's when the larger buildings will need to first meet the emission standards. The 20,000 to 35,000 square feet buildings will have until 2030 to meet the emission standards for the first time. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different pathways to meet the emission standards in a moment. And finally, BERDO will be overseen by a new review board. So this review board is still, we are working on the regulations for that soon, and that will be, once that's established, it will have oversight over BERDO, as well as an equitable emissions investment fund, which I'll also speak about in a moment. Next slide. So within the ordinance, there are a number of flexibility measures written in for compliance with the emission standards. First is owners with more than one covered building. They apply to comply across their portfolio. So this would allow for building owners with multiple buildings to plan their investments over time and potentially reduce emissions significantly in one building and then make an investment in another building later on and balance it out through a portfolio approach. Buildings will be able to apply for individual compliance schedules. So being able to apply for meeting a different timeline for the emissions goals, all while maintaining a zero by 2050 and a pathway to get there. And they will also be allowed to apply for hardship compliance plans. So this would be for buildings with unique characteristics or circumstances that present a hardship in complying with the standards. So this could be affordable housing, refinancing timelines, historic designation, financial hardship, and others. And these would have to be approved by the review board. Next slide. Okay, so how can buildings comply with the emission standards? There are a number of different pathways that they can pursue to reduce their emissions. The first, and one that we're really hoping that buildings pursue aggressively, is to retrofit their buildings and fuel switch. So making investments in improving their energy performance and reducing fossil fuel consumption within the building. So this could include things like envelope improvements, upgrading appliances, and switching from fossil fuel systems to electric or other renewable options, and improving building operations and controls. We have currently we've started a retrofit resource hub, which is an online website that has a number of resources for technical assistance and financial resources for buildings to help them think through these processes. And we're planning on expanding this hub in the future and building out additional resources for technical assistance for buildings to identify ways that they can reduce energy in their building. Next slide. The second thing buildings can do is to purchase renewable energy to reduce their emissions and meet the emission standards. So this could be either deploying renewable energy on site or purchasing renewable electricity that's generated off-site through Boston's Community Choice Electricity Program, Mass Class 1 RECs, or power purchase agreements. Next slide. And finally, buildings that are still above their emission standard will have an option to make an alternative compliance payment to come into compliance with the emission standard. So this, the alternative compliance compliance payment cost is initially set at $234 per metric ton of CO2. And this is tied to the average retrofit cost per metric ton of CO2e. And the ACPs will be paid into an equitable emissions investment fund, which will be used to fund, actually you can go to the next slide. I have a slide on it. Yep, perfect, thank you. And this new fund will be dedicated to building emissions reduction projects that prioritize environmental justice populations and benefits, including affordable housing preservation and rent stabilization, air quality improvements, training and access to green jobs for residents, women, and people of color, clean energy deployment. And these funds will be allocated by the newly created review board. Next slide. So buildings that are subject to comply with BERDO will have to self-certify their annual data submission and report their data every year. And then there's a requirement for third-party verification every 5 years, including the first year of reporting. So this year, 2022, is the first year that this new ordinance is in effect. So all buildings reporting will need to be also getting third-party verification of their data. There are some penalties for non-compliance. So if a building fails to comply with the reporting requirements, they can see penalties up between $150 and $300 per day. And if they're failing to comply with the emission standard, the penalties would be between $300 and $1,000 per day. But just, I do want to point out that the way the ordinance is written is that if you're not complying with the emission standards, you would be able to, let's say you're above the emission standards, you can make an alternative compliance payment, and that would be likely significantly less than having to pay the penalties for failing to come into compliance with that standard. Next slide. So we're very busy in the Environment Department working on getting everything set up for implementing this new ordinance. We're in the middle of a regulations development process. We just drafted the first phase of regulations that are written to enable reporting in 2022. And currently are in the middle of our first informal comment period for these phase 1 regulations. We'll have future phases of regulations development that will focus on compliance with emission standards, establishment of the review board, and other necessary topics. And we're continuing to do ongoing stakeholder engagement throughout this process to hear from building owners and folks who report and other people involved in the building industry as we continue to develop this program out. We're also committed to helping building owners comply and understand the obligations under BERDO and pathways that they can meet the emission standards. And as I mentioned before, we're continuing to expand our retrofit resource hub, which will provide additional resources for building owners. Next slide. And just lastly, if you're interested in learning more, please visit boston.gov/BERDO. We've got lots of information there, and we'll continue to update it as we develop regulations and reporting requirements. So that is it, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. So before I pass it off to our final speaker, to Dennis, we do have another survey question that we're going to pull up over on the right in the poll. So it looks like that should be up now. So this question here is, how experienced are you and or your company in strategic energy management, or SEM? So A, you have no experience, B, you have some experience, or C, very experienced. So I'll give you all a few seconds to answer that before I close the polling and we look at the results. Okay, we will close the poll here in just a second now. So any last minute people who have not submitted an answer, please do so now, and we will close it shortly. Great. Emily, whenever you have the chance, you can close that and we can look at the summary. Okay, great. Thank you all for answering that. So it looks like a majority have some experience and a pretty even spread with no experience and very experienced. So thanks so much for answering that. It's very interesting to see what the answers are for these. And now, without further ado, I'll move on to our final speaker. So Dennis, take it away.
Thank you. Let me set up the presentation here. You all see my first slide?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying thanks to Emily Border and her team, also to the New England Energy Management Best Practices Network for the invitation to share our experience. My name again is Dennis Villanueva, and I'm the Senior Manager of Energy and Sustainability for Mackinac Brigham. A couple of things about Mackinac Brigham. We are the one of the largest healthcare systems in Massachusetts. We are the largest private employer. We have about close to 80,000 employees, and we also have the largest research program in the country, medical research. We have about a little over 22 million square feet of space. So one of the, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to share of our experiences here. So basically, we're going to talk about our journey to reduce energy consumption and emissions at our facilities. And our strategy rests pretty much in three pillars. And I think the first and most important of them is energy conservation. I'm going to talk a little bit more on detail later in the presentation, but energy conservation it should be the first and best tool to lower emissions. We need to make sure that our resources are used effectively, and not only that, we get the benefits of also saving money, plainly put. The second pillar of that strategy is the installation of on-site renewable, also getting into long-term contracting for renewable energies within the region, and long-term procurement of renewable energy and carbon offsets. I have to say that to date we have not done any carbon offset, but it's something that we are continuously looking at. And the third pillar, it might be counterintuitive, but it is on-site generation. And I can go a little more into that detail later. So in 2008, and this was coincidental with the Green Communities Act, it was enacted around the same time. We started with the initial strategic energy master plan that included 10 of our largest hospital systems with the goal to reduce 25% energy consumption across the system. And these are some of the numbers that came out of the initial study. We did energy surveys and estimates of energy to be saved and monetary value of that savings, as well as participation that we were going to get from utility incentives. And I'm happy to report that we actually exceeded those goals, and we met that 25% reduction in 2019 and revised to reach a new goal of 40% energy reduction by 2025. We believe that this can be obtained. One of our major hospitals has already reached 40% reduction, and we are learning from the experiences in doing energy conservation, what the obstacles were for some of the hospitals to encourage and to assist them in reaching 40% across the board. The second pillar, as I was talking, is the installation of renewable energy on site. We have a variety of initiatives in business models. We have renewable energy installations on site. We also have renewable installations off site. We own renewable energy systems. We do PPAs, long-term PPAs with developers on renewable systems through the solar programs mostly, and we have also done long-term agreements with the largest one was with a wind farm in New Hampshire, which provides which we procured 75% of the total output on energy and renewable energy credits from that facility. All of those efforts amount to about a little more than 20 to 22% of the total energy consumed by our facilities. As I said, we have a variety of engagements that we have done in long-term procurement. At the top left, you'll see two systems that are on-site installations that provide solar credits to produce clean energy to the grid. In two of our facilities, one of them, the one at the center top, is Assembly Row. Our corporate office is in Assembly Row. And at the left bottom is an example of several long-term contracts that we have done for community solar. So our motivation to do this is not only, well, it is to help the transition to clean energy for the state, for New England, hopefully the country as a whole, but also to allow others to take advantage of our purchasing power. For example, as many of you know, community solar requires an anchor customer for the project to be financed. That anchor customer can take up to 50% of the energy and credits from, mostly credits from those installations, but also allow the residential sector and more importantly, low-income customers to get access to renewable energy. And to the right, we have a snapshot of 2 out of 9 3-megawatt windmills that we have in Antrim, New Hampshire, which we have a long-term contract with. We actually take physical possession of that power, so we use that power at our facilities and also Tier 1 RECs. The third pillar, and as I was explaining, is a little bit of counterintuitive. Our hospitals have an obligation to be resilient in our operations, especially in severe weather events where the utility can have long-term outages. So we must be able to operate for days or sometimes for weeks, as it has happened, for example, in several of the storms, Katrina, Sandy, which we've seen on the newspapers, hospitals being evacuated because they didn't have the capacity to operate. So it is of great importance to us, but also, and there's a little bit of misconception that because this on-site generation resources use gas, natural gas, today there's really no other fuel that we can use, that these facilities increase emissions, which to us is not accurate. Every megawatt hour that you can generate on site efficiently, and a well-designed CHP works at 75–80% efficiency, would have set about 2 to 3 megawatts of upstream generation for plants that are lower efficiency. You know, generators upstream can generate between 30–40%. That's before transmission and distribution losses. So using the same fuel, we are being more effective in lowering emissions per unit of energy, and also providing resiliency to our facilities. So we have a combination of combined heat and power installations as well as fuel cells. And fuel cells are an interesting element here because what they actually do is extract hydrogen from the natural gas and use it on a chemical process to produce electricity. So this technology might be more than ready to be able to be fueled by hydrogen if we ever cross that bridge of making hydrogen an alternative fuel to natural gas. So one thing that I want to mention here, there's another thing that it has helped us in our reduction of emissions is fuel switching. So one of the things that was not measured in what I'm going to show later here is that we don't count in the reduction. Is originally we had several facilities that run with oil number 6, oil number 2. We converted all those to natural gas. And also our main campus for Mass General Hospital, we are almost zero emissions from that campus, very low emissions due to clean steam. And I know there's a question for me and from the audience, and I will address that in the Q&A section. So results today, we have reduced almost 60% of emissions from our baseline in 2008. From what is left of the emissions, 2/3 come from direct use of natural gas at our facilities. That's mostly for CHP and boilers. And 1/3 comes from district systems. About 45% of all that district systems, let's call it half and half, comes from electricity and the rest from steam and chill water. This is the contribution that each of those pillars have provided to the total reduction to date. Energy conservation accounts for about 20% of those reductions. Renewable energy procurement and strategy, 37%, and on-site generation, 43%. It is important to note here that we calculate reductions in a different way that are generally done in some organizations or some governmental entities. The actual reduction of emissions is not site emissions. It should be measured. The absolute reduction is on source emissions. So that's how, in other words, we are generating on site and displacing a lower efficiency generator upstream. So when we generate 1 megawatt downstream, we are actually reducing the output of a marginal unit that is typically gas, and today might actually be coal, and reducing those emissions upstream. So that's an important clarification there. So this chart shows our journey from 2008 and shows the carbon emissions intensity from 2008 today. And just to contrast this and bring, we are subject to the Boston BERDO requirements. I overlaid what the standards are for the new BERDO, or what was known as BERDO 2.0 requirements, which are about 15.4 kilograms per square foot per year, needs to be the requirement for 2025, 10 by 2035. And so as a portfolio of our Boston facilities, today we are at about 8.5 kilograms per square foot per year. As you can see, 2002 was slightly higher because we had to change a lot of the ventilation requirements due to COVID. Well, that's all for now, and I look forward to your questions. And you can take that back.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks so much to Dennis, Hannah, and Brendan on those very informative